If democracy in the United States or in France or in Italy lapses, it moves to a Hungary or Poland-like situation. And if it gets worse from that stage, it moves to something like Russia. And if it gets worse from that place, it moves to something like China. So there is a spectrum. And the spectrum is really important because, of course, you want to understand how different societies in the world works, but it's really important from a self-centered point of view if you are a citizen of a Western country, because you gotta know what the next destination on the train journey is. What's the next stop? What's the one after? What's the one after that? And if you have in your mind a very black and white picture of what is and isn't a democracy, then you're going to be unalert and unawake to the threads and ferments of democratic decline in your society today, and they're going to be less empowered as a citizen to watch for them. So in this light, this is an important conversation. The specific focus today is going to be a society like Russia, and we're going to touch on Russia specifically because today there are protests in Russia directed at the imprisonment of the leading opposition figure, Alexei Navalny. But this is going to be an evergreen conversation about what it means to protest against the government in a hybrid authoritarian regime. What can you get away with? What can't you get away with? And what's the regime's attitude to you going to be like? I hope you enjoyed this video. The most basic ethical thought for modern human beings that have been around for the last 300 years, is that each person has equal moral worth. We didn't think this before, but we think it now. And we find it very difficult to get away from that thought. That's not to say that we act in accordance with it, but it is to say that we are always acting in some kind of interaction with that thought. We're always aware of it, we're always responding to it, even if we go around engaging in genocide. Some of the stories we'll tell about the genocide we've engaged in will try to cover up our actions in terms of them complying at least somehow with the idea that human beings are of equal moral worth. For example, we'll say, well, these others weren't real human beings. I mean, they weren't quite there, so we had to... So you're always acting in reference to that thought. And if you're a repressive regime, you know that you can't disregard that thought without consequences. Now, if you're North Korea and you've got complete vertical control in your country, the consequences might be minor. But if you are Russia, the consequence for disregarding that thought on a large scale are considerable. They will make you ask questions. Well, if we go that far, will we destabilize our hold on power because we're going to piss off millions of people? So you're always aware that going too far against this very basic modern world ethical feature could get you into trouble. Today, there are going to be protests all over Russia because Alexei Navalny is in jail and because Russians are not happy with their regime. At least a significant minority of them are not happy. So what if the Russian government said, we're going to round up 10,000 protesters, beat them up, and then incarcerate them without trial and throw away the keys? Could they, and maybe torture them along the way a little bit, throw in some Gestapo-like tactics? Could the Russian regime get away with it? Well, in the sense that it won't just collapse overnight. If it does that, yeah, of course it could. But it won't do it. And it can't do it. Because it will judge that the costs of doing that are too great. It would have seen how bad behavior toward protesters further activates the population just next door in Belarus. Now, of course, Russia is different to Belarus. The key difference is that, well, first of all, Russia is a much more functional state, but also in Belarus, you've got a population where each important demographic doesn't like the government anymore, and you don't have a single major demographic that strongly likes the government. these two things are not true of Russia. So they're different circumstances. But nevertheless, Russians would have been aware how the population turned more and more against the regime, the more the regime used extremely unlovely tactics. Now, of course, these tactics can be used by a regime like Russia against a particular set of individuals or a particular individual. Indeed, they have been used against Alexei Navalny. He had a sort of funny show trial where the court came out to him, and underneath a portrait of the founder of the gulag, Navalny got some kind of rather incoherent legal judgment. And then we're going to hear more what they're going to do with him in the next few weeks. So they're not unwilling to do this with a select number of individuals, but they're not willing to generalize this to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. Moreover, they couldn't even generalize it, because the only way that you get these sorts of extreme treatments that Navalny is most extremely on the wrong end of now, is when all of the organs of state and all of the organs of security are personally couriered from the top. Now, that just can't be done for more than a select number of individuals. And if you don't personally courier them from the top, then they act in a messy way. The main organs of the security state in Russia are in conflict with one another. They're not very well coordinated. It's very, very hard to universalize across very large numbers of people the particular targeted repressions that the Russian state is increasingly engaging in. Let's insert here a very quick definition of what I call the hybrid authoritarian state. That's not original. You get this sort of labeling in much social scientific literature. And the idea is a little bit different to what intuitively it might sound like. A hybrid regime might sound to you like a regime that's a blend of a dictatorship and a democracy. But that's not what's meant. A hybrid regime is really an imitative regime. And Russia is a perfect example of an imitative regime. An imitative regime imitates being a democracy and imitates being an authoritarian regime. And what the balance is obviously depends on which country you're looking at. Russia probably spends 80% of its time impersonating a regime that's closer to what China is actually like, and about 20% of the time impersonating a sort of North American or Western democracy. That's quite interesting. So the impression the Russian state wants to give its citizens is that it's a more authoritarian regime than it really is. And the way this works is that people who misbehave according to what the government deems misbehavior, most of them get away with whatever they're up to. Let's say they're criticizing the government online. But 1 out of 50 or 1 in 100 will be picked on and treated very harshly and very arbitrarily. And then they will listen to what happens. Have the other 99 stopped behaving badly? Have they shut up? No, they haven't. Okay, let's pick on one more and then see what happens. So it's a sort of arbitrary situation where what the government do to the people they pick on is almost never generalized or universalized. And so it's got this uncomfortable feature that on the one hand, you're most likely to get away with quite a lot actually, but there is also a chance that you won't. These demarcations are not clear. Now, they're not, of course, these sort of awfully unclear demarcations that you got in the Soviet period. And the key distinction, one of the key distinctions between the Soviet Union at its worst and Nazi Germany is that in Nazi Germany, if you belonged to a certain group of people, you knew you would be pretty safe. Whereas in the Soviet Union, you could be the most loyal director of a factory and you could still be taken away overnight. You didn't need to be Jewish, you didn't need to be anti-communist, you could just be disappeared. So of course we're not talking about arbitrariness of this kind, but we're talking about arbitrariness in Russia of the kind whereby you could post 20 anti-government posts on Instagram and 49 times out of 50 nothing bad will happen to you, but the one time out of 50 you could have serious problems with the law, be put away for a couple of years, and indeed be more or less deprived of a career. You might be put on some kind of terrorist list, your banking might be frozen, you might be very, very severely, in a sort of life-altering way, inconvenienced. Let's illustrate the workings of a hybrid authoritarian regime like Russia by pointing out the interesting way that Navalny is being project managed and couriered, like who is overseeing his fate at the moment. Now, Gleb Pavlovsky, who used to be a Putin strategist and is now an opponent of the regime, claims that there is a conflict at the heart of the regime between the civilians, who think that a softer approach is more effective, and the siloviki, the security and military people, who want a tougher line. Now, they have the same end, which is to neutralize Navalny politically. At the moment, Pavlovsky claims, the security and military folks have the lead, and it's their approach that's being implemented. The first step was to kill Navalny, and it didn't work. So now they might go for a significant prison term. Whereas the civilians are more in favor of managing Navalny by overburdening him with a plethora of court cases, searches, confiscations, making his life extremely difficult, rather than doing anything physically harmful to him or putting him away for a very long period of time. So there is a conflict. And Gleb Pavlovsky is actually saying that this conflict is further elevating Putin's power, which has been declining, because he can act as the referee. And at the moment, he has given the stage to the security military folks, and their idea of what should happen is being rolled out. And Pavlovsky claims the civilians are already saying, well, look, guys, this is not working. The killing Navalny thing hasn't worked out very well for us. This whole rerouting of the plane and taking Navalny in the airport has looked rather silly and embarrassing. And is a long-range prison sentence really going to deflate his power, or is it going to, in fact, galvanize his support? Let's apply some of the same basic dynamics to a street protest and how a regime like this responds to a street protest. There is a very interesting paradox here, which again touches on this sort of distinction between the civilians who might push one way and the hardline folks who might push the other. But of course, both, again, are interested in the maintenance of this authoritarian and, I would argue, illegitimate regime. But it's very important that there's this very paradoxical situation. Because when police or the security forces engage in violence in a Western democracy, they can get away with quite a bit of violence, because the assumption is that they are legitimate and that in certain circumstances it's quite appropriate for them to engage in violence. Even the most fervent advocate of defund the police in the United States actually does believe in the legitimacy of the police as an institution in principle. Whereas in an authoritarian society, there is skepticism about the legitimacy of the police altogether, because they are defending this government that is partly illegitimate or fully legitimate. By the way, we're going to have a conversation separately on this channel about what legitimacy is. Is it a matter of degree? How can you gain it? How can you lose it? And what's the point of that concept? What kind of things does it help us with if we use it properly in practice? But anyway, the paradox is that an authoritarian regime, when it engages in violence, risks always looking illegitimate, whatever it does. Even if the police do something relatively reasonable, like stop a rioting crowd, they might look illegitimate because there is nothing they can do that's legitimate. And so, because they are an illegitimate institution at core, at least that's going to be the perception of some of the citizens and the perception of arguably most citizens to some extent. And so they are especially fearful, actually, about engaging in excessive violence in these sort of hybrid authoritarian regimes, because the more violence they engage in, the more likely they are to put the illegitimacy of the regime in a glass house. So they have a certain kind of interest to minimize the extent to which the police engage in violence, in a way that, funnily enough, Western democracies don't, because they are entitled quite transparently to a sort of minimal effective dose of actual violence, whereas the Russian regime might just be regarded as illegitimate, whatever it does. And so that might, now it depends who is making these decisions, but that might and often will put the brakes on any plans to engage in violence against the population. And Vladimir Putin is personally aware of this. He has called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in modern history.
Разрушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века.
That's delusional, but that seems to be his sincere view. So he is aware of the process of regime collapse, and he is aware of how overreach can contribute to it. Now, he's not always good at translating this into the contemporary Russian context, but there you go. Let's take a quick example to illustrate our point here, by the way. In 2019, there were protests in Moscow against candidates being blocked from participating in elections to the local city Duma. And the National Guard beat these folks up. And what followed was a much bigger demonstration, the biggest demonstration in Russia since the early 1990s. And that was in good part spurred on by overreach from the security forces against peaceful protesters. But there is a but to what we've just said about the reservation of this type of regime to engage in mass-scale brutal behavior. And that's that they're very keen to get people to stay off the streets. And so to get people to not come out and protest, they are happy to threaten that they will do all kinds of brutal things en masse. And these threats are sometimes made directly. In the last few days, the Russian government has been buying quite a few Google ads to scare people about what might happen to them if they go and protest. They send instructions to schools and academic institutions to put a warning on students about coming out. Often this doesn't lead anywhere. In other words, students are threatened that they'll get evicted and thrown off their courses. But this can happen, but it's actually very unusual for it to be followed all the way through. And very often you can reverse this decision by making a public fuss about it. There have also been, of course, dropping leaks from various security organs about potential bad behavior, and they have been inserting themselves into online forums where young people might talk about their plans for going out and protesting. And these threats are multifaceted and even go as far as the use of firearms on innocent and peaceful protesters. Now, if that were to happen, it would go against the expectations of nearly anybody who is an expert on the way the Russian state behaves, but they are keen to get these threats out there. At the moment, they're particularly concerned about the hundreds of millions of views on TikTok that various messages about young people going out and joining the protests have got. But let's make it concrete. What happens if you are in a country like Russia and you go out and protest? What are your risks? Well, the situation in Russia is that if you are out there without a placard, and you're not one of the last people to leave, and you behave peaceably, and you don't threaten anybody, you don't throw anything, you don't threaten police officers, your chances of coming back home peacefully and having no legal consequences are high, probably over 90%. Now, that's not going to be the case if you're a public figure. You're much more likely to be twisted up and taken away. In that case, you're taking greater risks. So if that's sort of the 90% scenario, what happens if you do get arrested? Well, in Russia, you're going to be typically put in a police van, and you might sit there for hours upon hours because they're going to wait to fill up that van with folks. And then these folks might be taken to a police station somewhere in Moscow or even outside Moscow. You'll be typically unloaded into a cell with many other people from the protest. You're going to socialize with them. It might be uncomfortable, it might be cold. They might also allow smoking in the cells. But most people are going to be forced to do quite a bit of bureaucracy, and they're going to be given a court date or an indication of a forthcoming court date, and then sent home without spending the night in jail. There is a chance that you could be there for a day or two or more, but that's disadvantageous to the local police station. They wouldn't want the attention, they wouldn't want to foot the bill for your presence there, so they're gonna be keen to get rid of you. Then, in a further minority of cases, unfortunately, you might be charged with something more than just unsanctioned protest. Oh, by the way, protest is sort of theoretically legal in Russia, but the government has got around this with a funny loophole which says that yes, you can protest about anything you like, but you're gonna have to get the process agreed to and sanctioned first. And if it's not sanctioned, then it's against the law. So you'll often be just plonked with a sort of unsanctioned protest charge, and that's going to be a financial fine that you're going to get in court. But some people, and unfortunately this will often be quite arbitrary, may be charged with the sort of crime that's commensurate with rioting, setting things on fire, assaulting police officers and so on. And in that case, you might be seriously affected. You might lose your employment chances, your education chances, your banking situation might be frozen over. You might be severely inconvenienced for life, to put it mildly. It might be a life-altering consequence, and you might need to wait until there's regime change to actually recover from this situation. And part of the logic of this is that this should happen to a very small minority of people so that others are more aware about the risks. So there is this sort of completely undefended, unprotected pocket you can fall into, a kind of pocket that is pretty impossible in a Western democracy. You're extremely unlikely to end up there, but if you are unlucky, you could end up in that situation. That really is a bad situation in which to be. There isn't a way to land this sort of conversation because you could always continue making further descriptions and further comparisons. But let's say something very core and important about these kind of regimes. And it's this. If you are a Russian citizen, the aim of the Putin regime is not to brainwash you into an ideology or even to brainwash you into the legitimacy story. That is the story that the government tells about itself. Why not? It doesn't actually have a legitimacy story. It doesn't have a story that says this is why we're good and this is what we're doing and come along with us. It actually has many different stories about itself that are incompatible. Well, why would a regime throw out incompatible stories about itself? Well, it's the same reason as to why the regime would throw out incompatible stories about what happened to Alexei Navalny. The Soviet regime would make up its mind about what supposedly happened to him, make up some kind of line and stick with it. But the Russian regime said Navalny had some kind of a diabetic reaction, he poisoned himself, some kind of supporter tried to do this to him, a foreign intelligence agency did this to him. Let's pump all of these stories out there. And that's going on because the point is not to convince you of anything. The point is to confuse you, to sort of dispirit you about political life in your country, and to really, rather than politicizing you into a certain vision of politics in your country, to depoliticize you. So the regime is interested in you looking at politics, it looking rather unattractive, it looking a little bit threatening, but not too threatening, so that you're not going to be terribly intimidated in your private life. And then you just forget about it and you get on with your private life, because you're still allowed to travel, you're still allowed to do many things that you wouldn't be allowed to do back in the Soviet times. And so off you go. So the point for a regime like this is to keep most of its population depoliticized, rather than to keep them towing a particular party line. So we're going to carry this conversation on. We're going to keep talking about regimes like Russia. We're also going to talk about China and these sort of mild authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe, like Hungary and Poland. They are sort of intermediate. They're somewhere between France and Russia. Keep connected with us on this channel. We love having you here. Ask any questions, make any comments below this video. I also take video requests, so if you want something covered, then make a note of that below and let me know. Stay safe, and let's see how this protest today goes in Russia. And of course, if you're watching this video with a big delay, these are evergreen conversations that we're not going to stop having on this channel. Thanks a lot.